Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Casey Lee Live Software Edition. Every Thursday night around 8 p.m. Eastern, we basically cover software topics. Most of you know the routine, but if you're new here, welcome. Welcome, and thank you for watching. If you guys are new, a couple of things to kind of get out of the way. One, again, we're covering software topics. So everything from coding to process to product management, all these kind of really cool things. And usually it's kind of a split between a little bit of a formal lesson where I kind of talk through things or teach things, or you guys watch me code. And followed by kind of a general Q&A and discussion afterwards. So that's generally the name of the game here. It usually lasts between an hour and 2 hours. We'll see how things go tonight. And if you guys have any suggestions for topics or anything like that, you can always message me on Twitter, right there, or you can message through the live chat here, or these videos after they are live. After the live broadcast get posted in a recorded format, so you could always message on those as well. So we've always had some great discussions here and great suggestions. So definitely feel free to participate. Now, that being said, if you're new to YouTube Live, do know that your chat messages are recorded, not only in this video format here, but also through the live chat kind of interface on YouTube itself. So if you're concerned about privacy, you might want to just sign in with a different account or whatever, to kind of protect your privacy there. But if you're not super concerned about that, your real name or whatever, yeah, feel free to chat. I always definitely encourage more engagement, which is really good. So, okay, so another bit of exciting news is next week. I'm finally getting together with Dave Chapman to try to set something up. So I'm not making any promises right now that for sure it's going to happen next week. We're going to do a test early next week to see if things work, and if that test goes well, then he'll be joining me live next Thursday. So Dave Chapman is a regular viewer on this live stream, but also a huge influence on my software career. Again, I've said multiple times that he is one of the best software engineers I know, if not the best software engineer I know. So very excited to have him on. So we've decided that the first thing we're going to do is he is going to basically teach me Vue.js. So it'd be very interesting to see how this goes. So he's just going to join us via something like Skype, and he's kind of going to walk me through Vue.js and how to use it and how to deal with it. And I think what I'll try to do is ask as many questions as I can, and kind of also verbally express what's going on in my head to hopefully get people learning about things, and maybe he'll be able to share some thoughts as well. So Vue.js next week, hopefully next Thursday. Again, that's all dependent on a test that we're going to do early next week. So hopefully that works well. But join us next Thursday, 8 p.m. Eastern. If that doesn't happen, we'll still have something for you guys, and then very shortly after we'll have them. So, and then we'll see how that goes, and maybe that will continue for a couple sessions. So, okay. So yeah, again, if you're joining us, feel free to say hello. But I'm just going to jump right into it here because there's a lot of unknown tonight. So we're going to be kind of continuing our live coding sessions here for the last couple weeks. Things have been pretty busy. I found myself getting a little bit not tired of these streams, but more just physically tired. I'm tired at the end of my workday. Staring at a screen a lot. I'm getting a little bit tired. So it's hard sometimes for me to put in a lot of the same effort that I used to put in terms of like the slides and the lessons and stuff like that. So as a result, I've kind of been relying on these live coding sessions. So hopefully you guys are still kind of getting something out of it. I know I am. I'm learning stuff as we go. So hopefully you guys get that as well. So all right. So hello to Ricky. Ricky is a regular viewer now. He joined a couple weeks ago. Ricky's somebody that I met through a common mutual friend of ours, and he's been a regular viewer every week. So I really, really thank you, Ricky, for joining us every week, and hopefully you've been learning some React as we go along. As I said, if you guys are learning stuff, don't hesitate to ask me stuff as we go along. I really welcome the questions. Even when I switch away from this kind of live chat view, when I gotta go to something like this or like this, I still have the live chat sitting in the corner of my desk here, my desktop. So hopefully, I'll see your questions. I also see that we kind of have a couple more viewers joining us, which is good. So again, feel free to say hello. Feel free to get those questions going. There's Dave. So yeah. So hopefully Dave heard that announcement that we're targeting for him to be on next week to teach us all about Vue. So that'll be great. Okay. Okay, so today, so again, for the last couple weeks, we've been talking about React. To be honest, one of my favorite, I think, lessons that I've done on this recently was the whole Webpack setup with React and everything like that. And then once we kind of got going, we got into React itself. So I'm not going to do as tight a recap on Webpack as I did last week. So just assuming that Webpack is up and running and we're good to go, and we're just going to start to jump into React. And we already covered two major pieces of React, which are called props and state. And props and state, from a high level, not a high level point of view, from a functional, I don't even know a functional point of view, from a implementation point of view, maybe that's maybe the best way to put it, is that props are basically variables or values that do not change relative to the component itself, and state are values that change over time relative to the component itself. Now, again, state and props will become more evident the more components you build and the more you use them. So I think we're just kind of going to continue to build this stuff. So, but what I thought I would do today is start to talk about React in terms of how it interacts with a server, because we've been doing a lot of client-side code here, and which basically means code that runs in the browser. But at some point, when you start to build, a bigger application, most likely you're going to run into the scenario where you need to interact with server data, right? And so most likely this is going to come in the form of some kind of API, if you guys don't know what an API is, think of basically making web requests to a server and a server returning some data to you. Okay, so if you're used to kind of programming web pages, you might be used to making a request to a server and a server returns a web page to you. Well, an API or another way of looking at that is you can make a request to a server and a server returns data back to you, right? So not a full-blown HTML document, but maybe something like a JSON document or an XML document, right? So it's some plain data that you might want to interact with. So this is something obviously that is very common in the web and very common when we do things like Ajax. So I'm not going to talk about APIs and Ajax specifically. Today, I'm kind of going to assume that you know Ajax or APIs, but by all means, we are, again, a relatively small group here. So if you guys want me to slow down and say, hey, Casey, I don't know what Ajax is, can you please let me know what Ajax is? Go ahead and leave me a comment and say, I don't know what Ajax is. I'd like to know what that is. Or I don't know what JSON is. I don't know what these things are, okay? But if I don't hear from you guys, I'm going to assume that you know what that is and kind of just move forward and see how we incorporate Ajax and data into our React apps. Now, depending how that goes, we're also maybe getting into actually submitting data and dealing with forms, because forms is actually a very special situation with React. Most things in React you can think of in terms of props and state, and they're pretty easy to kind of navigate around and figure out. But forms, in a way, they do follow the exact same principles as the rest of React in terms of state and rendering that state. But they usually have some special attention dedicated to them because sometimes it's hard to envision how state interacts with a actual component in terms of actual like inputs, like text fields and radio buttons and these kind of things. So if we get to that, it's a special topic to cover in terms of React, is how React deals with forms. It is a little bit tedious for sure. It's a little bit of there's a lot of code that you kind of have to put in to get a form working. But what's really nice is that once you get it working, using that data in the form is actually really nice and easy. So, okay, so let's jump into it here. Whoops, I went to the wrong screen there. Okay, so here's where we left off last time. We basically had our Webpack dev server running. Okay, again, I'm just going to minimize that because we don't need that anymore. And we had a React component on this homepage. So we had a home.html, and the home.html basically imported this script homepage.js, which mounted a component to the alert link mount point. So if we look at the homepage.js, here's our React component, and it mounted to the alert link mount point. We actually renamed our component homepage because the React component was no longer just a link, but the entire page. Actually, the entire page was inside the rendering of the component, and then we mounted it to this HTML div here called alert link mount point. Okay. So let's just do a little bit of cleanup here. So again, alert link mount point doesn't probably make any sense anymore. So I'm just going to switch this to homepage mount point. That probably makes more sense. And then down here, we would switch this to homepage mount point as well. Okay, so I saved that. And then this will refresh. Everything still works. And so last week, what we did is we created a link down here. And when you clicked on that link, it called this function here. And what this function did is it basically grabbed the current state variable called number of clicks, and then it incremented it by 1 and called set state. And then the big lesson we learned last week is that when you call set state, it automatically re-renders the entire component. So this entire thing gets re-rendered. So that what would happen is this .state.number of clicks would now be a different number, right? Because if we incremented it and then re-rendered this, that would change. And then we also introduced some logic in here where we said, well, if the number of clicks is greater than 10, then show a certain CSS class in there. And this was kind of our first foray into conditional rendering, where we're kind of using kind of some slight JavaScript tricks here, namely the ternary operator to say, if this is true, render this, otherwise render this. And that helped us render a different div class on that. So then when we click this, it would change the number. And then every time the number changed, if it was greater than 10, it would turn red, okay? And the kind of reminder here is this whole declarative UI way of thinking, right? It's like you set up your entire UI based on any state that your component would be in. And then your event handlers and your actions and all these things that happen, all you do is you operate on the state and the render will react to that, right? So you are no longer directly manipulating the DOM. So if I click on this, you don't say go to the DOM and change that number. No. You set up the UI first and then you just change the state, okay? That's usually how I program React is I put the variable into the render component first and how it would work. And then what I do is I basically manipulate the state in my event handler or my action or whatever. Okay? Okay, so that is where we left off last time. Okay, so let's continue with this. And so where we want to head with this is I want to talk about a very common scenario, which is, again, grabbing data from an outside source and displaying that data on your website, okay? So this is our website here called Homepage Clicks, okay? And so let's get a little bit fancier with this. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna use a third-party service. I just found this week. It's called RecRes. So I'm assuming that stands for request response. And what this is a API that you can use freely for kind of development purposes. It's pretty cool. It's got a couple of endpoints here that return certain JSON data. So for example, if I were to go to this and type in /API/users, it actually returns this JSON data, okay? Now again, if you're not familiar with JSON data, the best way you can think of it is just key value pairs, very similar to a dictionary or a map or whatever. JSON literally stands for JavaScript Object Notation. So it's actually how JavaScript represents objects, is a bunch of key value pairs. So luckily, Firefox has this built-in JSON kind of parsers in the sense that if I look at here, this is actually what the data looks like. It's actually very tightly compact. You'll see there's a curly brace, and then there's a page, and then :1. Okay, so you can see this is what the data actually looks like. So if I were to take this data and grab it all and copy and paste it, and just kind of add some white space so it's clearer here, you can see what it starts to look like. So if I just kind of like add white space, okay, you can see page total, whatever. And then inside the data, we have an array, okay, and then inside that, we have this data here, okay? So luckily, Firefox has this built in to basically do this for us. So this is what the raw data looks like, and then it kind of parses it out for us so we can see it here in this nice form right here. So you can see here's the data, and the data that's coming back is it gives us a couple of things. So different APIs structure their data differently. So the way that they structure their data is they give us a little bit of header information. So in other words, information about the response itself. They say, okay, this is the first page of the response. We get 6 results per every page. There's a total of 12 results in the database entirely, and there's 2 pages total, basically, which makes sense, right? If you have 12 total results and 6 per page, then you have 2 pages total. And then they show the data itself. So then the data comes in as an array. So you have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And every item there has an ID, an email address, a first name, a last name, and an avatar. So there you go. That's that. And it looks like there's even an ad on this, actually, if you want to display an ad as well, which is kind of interesting. Okay, so that's the data that we're looking at. So what we're going to do is we're going to use Ajax to fetch that data and then use the state and React to kind of render that stuff, okay? Now, the request response basically has 2 main pieces of data. They have a collection of users, and then they have a collection of Pantone colors. If you guys know what Pantone colors are, it's this organization that defines colors that are used worldwide. But the way it works is you can actually pass in any name here, like say products, if I could type properly, products or orders or whatever, and it just returns a bunch of Pantone colors. So, I mean, rather than fake it, why don't we pretend that we're creating a website that actually has colors in it, okay? So we'll pass in the word colors, and we're actually going to display these colors out to the world, and that's how we're going to do it, okay? So that's kind of our goal here. Okay, so back here, when you're kind of learning React, one of the things they say that it's really good to do is kind of mock your data first in your code, like hard code your data so you can kind of get an idea of what it's going to look like. And I think I'm going to take that approach, which will be really good. Okay, so I'm actually going to get rid of this example here. We're not gonna do these handle number of clicks anymore. Okay. And we probably, actually, no, I'll get rid of that. We'll start from scratch there. We'll get rid of the handler, and we'll keep the initial state, but we're going to use some new variables in there now. And this stuff, yeah, I'm going to get rid of those links as well. Just start here. And, okay, we'll get rid of this. Okay, there we go. And, okay, so the header, I'm going to put as Pantone colors. Okay, I'm going to use the American spelling because there's so much code that uses the American spelling. I'm so used to doing the American spelling here. So I'm not going to pass in a title to this anymore. I'm just literally going to have this component that doesn't take in any props, actually. It just has the component itself. So we'll get that there. And we'll get rid of all this too. Okay, so pretty empty component at this point. So hit save and see what it looks like. Okay, Pantone colors. There we go. Perfect. Okay. Now I've been doing my CSS directly in the homepage, which is not really the ideal way to do it. But I actually don't know out of the box how to configure my CSS with Webpack. And rather than kind of waste too much time on that today, I'm just going to continue to hard code my CSS in here. So But what I'm going to do at least is I'm going to at least scope it to this component. So I'm going to give this outer div a class to scope that a little bit. So we'll say component homepage. Okay, just give it a name, component homepage. And that way when I do my CSS here, at least it'll be scoped to that. So component homepage. Okay. And so let's take the H1 here and just center it and see if that works. Okay, there we go. Maybe we'll even give it slightly different font. Okay, there we go. Okay, so let's see how this is going to work. Okay, so what we have is we have the page that loads. Okay, so this home page gets served to the customer, to the user. And then when that page gets loaded, it then loads in this piece of JavaScript. So this JavaScript right here is going to load. And this JavaScript is then going to make an AJAX call out to the world. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to load the Pantone colors from the AJAX call. And then once the Pantone colors are loaded, we basically want to render them out to the screen here, right? Okay, so let's say, so somewhere in this page, we're going to have some div that's going to have our collection of colors in it. So I'm just going to create an empty div there. And so I have this empty div here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by hard coding these colors. Okay, so in my state, I'm going, actually, even before the state, let's just hard code it here. Okay. All right, so I'm going to create an array called colors. All right, so it's going to be an array. And it's going to be an array of objects. And I'm going to mimic the data that's going to come back. Okay, so we know the data is going to come back like this. It's going to have an ID, a name, a year, a color, and a Pantone value. Okay, so I'm going to mimic that. So I'm going to actually create an array of objects. Okay. Now, what's really nice about ES 2015 is that you can have trailing commas like this. That way, if anybody needs to remove an object or add an object, you know, they won't mess up the commas. So we can put that. Okay, so we're gonna have an ID of 1 and a name of cerulean, and then a color value of 9. What is that? 98B2D1. Okay, and then a Pantone value of 154020. Okay, so let's just copy and paste that object a couple of times. Okay, so we have that. You know, I will just do the first 3, let's say. So fuchsia rose and true red. And what is this? C74375 and BF1932. And these Pantone values are 172031 and 1964. Okay, so there we go. We have an array of colors here, and that's in the render. Okay, so because we're just hard coding it right now. So let's just make sure that array makes sense. So if we do colors.length, we should see the number 3. There we go. So 3 colors there. Okay. All right. So now let's say I want to output these colors. Okay. So this is the first time we're going to use another trick of JavaScript and React and rendering. And this is a very common practice if you want to output a collection of objects. Okay. So one thing you actually can't do directly in JSX is you can't just do something like this. You couldn't do a loop. You couldn't do, say, for int, or no, for, you know, or let I equals 0, I is less than 10, or even let's say colors dot length, and then I plus plus, and then do something like that, and then return something. You can't do that because React is actually expecting these JSX components. And this is not really returning that, unfortunately. The best thing you could do is you could actually set up these components in an array and pass that array here. That you could do, actually. So I could actually create a set of components and put them into array and put them there. So one thing I could do, actually, is I could do something like this. I could say have a for loop, and I can't even remember how to do a for loop in JavaScript. Okay, so let's say I'm going to create an array. Actually, I think I can still do const. And it's going to be called the color component. So what this is, it's going to be an array of components, okay? So JSX is going to allow us to create basic components like this, okay? So I'm going to have an array of components similar to that, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off it being empty. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to loop over a component. So, sorry, loop over the array. So I is less than colors dot length, and then increment it plus plus. Okay. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to build a component. Okay. So I'm going to create a component. Okay. And it's going to look like this. So it's going to be a div where inside the div it's going to take the current color, their name. Okay, so that's the color component. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw that component onto the array. Okay, so I'm creating a component here and then throwing that component onto the array. So effectively what I would end up with at the end here is I would end up with something like this. I would end up with div cerulean, and then div fuchsia rose, and div true red. That's what effectively I'm going to end up with. But I'm looping through to create those components and then pushing those components onto the array. Now, React can render an array of components. That it can do, actually. The JSX can do that. So what I should be able to do then is throw in that array into here, and it should be able to understand that. Okay, so let's see if that actually works. There we go. Okay, so we got a div for every color in our loop there. Okay. Okay, now seasoned JavaScript developers should notice that there is a shorter way to do this statement right here, actually. So what we're effectively doing is we're taking one array and we are basically creating a new array where every single value in the first array maps to a different value in the other array, right? So if you think about it, we're looping through the array and we're basically mapping this first element here to this div with the color name. And then we're mapping the second one to the second value and so on. So we can actually do this in a way shorter statement called map. Okay, map will do the exact same thing here. So what we could do is we could replace this whole thing with colors.map. And so map is going to take in a function. Okay, so this is basically an anonymous function here. And the first argument or parameter of that function is the element that you're iterating over at that time. Okay, so the first time it'll be this object, then this object, then this object. Okay, and then what map does is inside the inner function you have to return a value. Okay, and the value we're going to return is that component. Okay, and typically if we're doing multi-line returns on JSX, we surround them with a parentheses like that. Okay, and then in here we could do color.name. And so what that's going to do is for every element in here, it's going to return color.name, and then that whole function then is going to return one gigantic array. And so really what we want to do is we want to set that to color components. Okay, so we can get rid of this line up here, and that's what we got there. Okay, so what we're doing is we're taking this array, and for every element, we're mapping it to this. And we're creating a brand new array with all those elements and then rendering those out here. Okay, so that should work. Okay, so that's still working nicely. And then the other thing is, well, I just told you that React can't deal with for loops, but they can deal with a function call that, or not, I shouldn't say a function call. They can deal with arrays, and hence can deal with a function call that returns an array. So this is an array here, and there's nothing saying we can't replace that with a function call. So this is a function call that returns an array. So we can effectively put this whole thing directly in here. Okay. I apologize, I do not have syntax highlighting for JSX in my environment here. But hopefully you can still make that out. Okay, so what I've done here is I've introduced these braces because I'm going to throw in some JavaScript. Then really this is one single function call. Okay, this is just one single function call, and the function call returns an array, and that array is made up of all these elements here. Okay, so refresh that. Hopefully that works. Actually, it won't like that semicolon there. Okay, and there we go. Okay. So the function call itself and the array, because you would not have the array with a semicolon at the end. JSX knows how to deal with that. Inside here, it's okay though, because this is a function inside that, and so you're okay to put a semicolon there. That should not be a problem. And I don't know why my hot refreshing is not working. Okay, there we go. Okay, so there we go. So that is a very, very common pattern in React if you want to render a collection. Okay, so we've now seen two very common patterns in React JSX rendering. One is the ternary operator. It's used quite a bit. And the other one is mapping. So anytime you need to iterate over a collection, map is usually your friend to do that there. Okay? All right, so there we go. We have... We have this div color name there, and we're good to go. Okay, so this is if we hard code the colors. Okay, that's how we get that out there. All right, so now, excuse me, just drop my coaster. So now let's say we now want to load those colors from a server. Okay. Okay, so again, this is a very common pattern, and what we're going to do is we are actually going to consider the fact that when you make an AJAX call is that it's asynchronous, right? And what asynchronous means is you fire off the request to the server, and the asynchronicity will mean that we do not pause this application from running. We don't pause the execution of this program and wait for it to come back. We actually fire it off and then run the rest of the program. And then when it responds, we react at that point. Okay. So one thing to know about that is that then that means that we have to account for the fact that there may be a certain point where there are no colors, right? Okay. So when we start and we load this component at the beginning, when it first calls render, there's going to be no colors. And then we're going to fire off an AJAX call to get those, okay? Okay, so let's do that. So that being said, that means at some point there's no colors, and at some point there is colors. Okay, so that means that over the life cycle of this component, what's in colors is going to change. And so that would make perfect sense for a state variable. Okay, so let's create a state variable called colors. And we'll start off by setting it to empty. Okay, so it's just empty to begin with. All right, so it's empty to begin with. And let's use that empty state for the colors down here. Okay, so rather than hard coding this, we're gonna get rid of this. So we have that empty state, and so we're gonna use this dot state dot colors instead. So we're actually using this variable rather than this hard coded variable in here. Okay, so if I refresh that now, this is going to be empty, which makes sense because if you map over an empty array, it's going to return nothing. Right? It's going to be another empty array. So React is basically rendering an empty array in this case. Okay. So now let's say I hard code that array. Whoops. So let's say I hard code that array now into here. So I have a hard coded array of colors in the state here. Okay. Now it's using that state array and it's loading those. Okay, so that's good. So that's really just moving where we're declaring colors. Like we're moving colors from just being a variable in the render method or function to inside the state variable. Okay. All right. So now it's in the state variable. It's going to change over time. We're good to go. Okay. So now the other thing though is again we have to kind of envision now moving forward that we're going to make a request to the server and then have those values come back. Okay. So let's actually start with this empty, like I said. Okay, so now it's empty. And at some point, we're going to load those colors from the server. Okay, so let's create an actual function called load colors, okay? And ultimately, what this is going to do in the future is, again, load the colors from the server. But to start off, we're just going to kind of hard code it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this dot set state, and I'm going to now update colors to that hard coded array that we had. Okay. So what's happening here is we are basically saying that, okay, whenever we call load colors, which we haven't yet, by the way, we're going to change colors from this empty array to this array that has these three values in it, okay? So remember, when we call set state, it's going to re-render. So the very first time this renders, it's going to render this with whatever colors this .state.colors is, which is an empty array. So it's going to start off empty. Then at some point in the future, we're going to call load colors, okay? And when that happens, it's going to change the state variable colors and then re-render this whole thing again, okay? So if I just save that, okay, this page is going to render with empty colors, and then at some point we call this, and then it will load that. Okay, so how are we going to call that? Okay, so let's just make sure this works first. So let's just kind of do what we did last week by adding a link that we were going to click on, okay? So we're just going to create this link here, okay? And we're going to create a new variable, or a new method called handle click, and we'll say load colors, okay? And then so we'll create a new function called handle click, all right? And we have to bind these because we're going to be using this .setState, and this is referring to the component. And so if we don't bind this function to that, this has a different scenario. This has a different meaning down here. So we're going to bind actually all of these. So we're going to do load colors is equal to this .load colors .bind to this, and handle click as well. All right. So we have that binded. So now this will be permanently referring to the component. So we can call this set state. Okay, so what happens here is we'll have a handle click here, and let's just make sure that works. All right, so when I click on this, there's an alert hello, so that's good. So we know that this click handler is being called here. So inside here, I'm going to call load colors. Okay. So what's going to happen there? So I'm going to click on this link, And when we click on this link, it's going to call this function. This function is going to call this function up here. And then this function is going to call setState and update the colors variable. So when we call setState, that'll change the value of colors and also cause render to re-render. So it's going to call this again, and when we call it this time, this.state.colors is going to have a different value with those three things in there, right? Okay, so click on load colors, and there you go, the three colors are loaded. Okay. So you click on this, which calls this, which calls this, which causes the whole thing to re-render. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. So really all we've done here is really no different than what we did last week, in the sense that all we're doing is we're clicking on a link, and that's changing a state variable, causing a re-render. And the state variable in this case is colors. It went from an empty array to a populated array. And the only slightly different thing here is we are rendering that array using the map, and we also have kind of delegated this handling up to here. Like we called another method to actually handle it. Okay. All right. So that's kind of similar to what we want to happen, right? We want when the component loads, it's empty, and then when we load the colors, it re-renders. So we're doing pretty well there. Okay. So what we can do now is we can change how this loading happens. So it's kind of weird to come to a page expecting the Pantone colors to be loaded and then have to click on load colors, right? It's more likely that when they come to the page, we automatically invoke load colors and then it loads the colors up for us, right? So what we can do is we can actually call load colors as soon as the component mounts. Okay, so once the component is kind of mounted and rendered, we can basically call some extra functionality, okay? So there is a special function in React components. There's a couple of them, actually, and they're called lifecycle functions, in the sense that they plug into the lifecycle of the component, okay? So what will happen is if you define these functions, they will be called at certain points in the lifecycle of the component, okay? So when it mounts, when it unmounts, these kind of things, okay? Okay, so one of the most common ones is called component did mount. Okay, so if you create a function called component did mount, it's going to be called as soon as the component mounts to the web page, okay? So right here, when we call this render, it's going to mount that component. And as soon as that component gets mounted, it's actually going to call this for us. Okay, so we can prove that here, actually. If we do a console.log, we can say component mounted. Okay, and if we look in the console, once this refreshes, as soon as it mounts, you'll see components mounted. Okay? So what we can do then is we can say as soon as a component mounts, call load colors. So as soon as the component mounts, it calls load colors, and it goes really fast. Like you basically couldn't see it without the empty state there. Okay? So there we go. Okay, now you might be asking, well, what? This seems really cumbersome. Like, why didn't you just set this array up here in the constructor? Because that's basically what you're doing. Like, you're mounting it and then you're setting it up there. That is true. We're in a kind of a contrived example right now. But the reason is because I'm still grabbing the local data hard-coded. When we go to actually fetch the data from the server, we need to do it in these two steps because it's going to take some time to fetch the data from the server. So we need to start this off with an empty state, go fetch the data, and while it's waiting, be able to handle that situation. Okay. So we can get rid of this handle click. We can get rid of this. Okay, and then basically what's happening here is we're loading. There's a split second where the colors is empty and it renders that. And then what's happening? Oh, sorry, need to get rid of this binding as well. Sorry. So we load the page. There's a brief moment where the array is empty, and then component mount gets called, which calls load colors, which then loads up the colors, and then that renders down here. Okay. If you have any questions, let me know. I know I went a little fast there, but basically the main thing I've introduced here now is component did mount, which is basically a method or function that you can plug into that's going to get called as soon as the component mounts. So when it mounts, the instant it mounts, all I'm doing is changing the state, which calls render to happen again. Okay. Now, one thing I should mention here is you'll see that we're getting this each child in a list should have a unique key prop. Okay, so what they mean by that is in React, if you have a collection of items in a list, okay, specifically a list of components, okay, so if you have a list of components being rendered, so in this case we have a list of these divs here, it needs to keep track of what div is what, okay, and because if you start to kind of rearrange those divs for whatever reason, or you start doing things to those divs, one thing that's tricky with that is it can basically have a lot of trouble with the virtual DOM re-rendering. Okay, so I talked about this virtual DOM, and the virtual DOM has to basically detect differences between what's actually changed in the virtual DOM versus what's changed in the real DOM. Okay. And so the virtual DOM gets fully re-rendered and then has to do the diff between the two. And in order for it to keep track of any listings, every item in a listing needs a unique prop called a key. Okay? And usually the best way to deal with keys is think about what you're rendering and do you have a unique way to identify each item that you're rendering. Okay? So here we're rendering a color, right? We're rendering a color. And is there a way that we can uniquely identify each color? Well, yes, there is, because we have IDs, right? IDs are uniquely identifying these colors. So a good thing to put into the key here is the ID. Whoops. The ID. Okay. So anytime you render a collection of JSX elements in a list, and they're kind of adjacent to each other, to help the React Virtual DOM, you have to pass it a key that's unique, that uniquely identifies each row. Now, if you don't have things like ID, you can use like an index. So if you're iterating over, you can actually pass an index. A second param of map is index, so you can just pass that in. And as long as that's enough for what you're doing to uniquely identify it, then you should be good to go. Okay, so we just did a ton there. Okay, so ultimately, we haven't done a ton new because basically all we're doing is we have a state variable and we're changing that state variable, which causes re-render to happen. That's really what we've done. And the way we call the function that changes the state variable is we're using component did mount. That is brand new. And the way we're rendering our collection, which is brand new, is using the map, the JavaScript map function. Okay. All right, so this is all coming together. So the last bit we have to do now is we have to now actually grab this data from the server. Okay? So we actually have to grab this from a real place now. Okay, so how do we do that? Okay, so I am going to use jQuery to do this actually. There are a couple ways you can do AJAX calls. You can do them from scratch and do native JavaScript. That is a little bit tedious. A lot of people don't use that these days, but this is native JavaScript and how you do that. You create a new XML HTTP request object, which is built into JavaScript in the browser. And then you set a couple properties, like it's a GET request and the URL and all this stuff. And then you handle whenever it actually loads, you handle this and you do that. In ES 2015, there is a new new function called fetch, which works as well. And I find fetch is pretty good. It's definitely cleaner than this, but it's still not quite as clean as jQuery's AJAX function. jQuery's AJAX function seems to be a really, really nice implementation to do AJAX actually. Now, if you were doing this in real life, you might not want to do that if you're not using jQuery for anything else, because jQuery is a pretty big library, and if all you're using it is for this one AJAX function, you might not want to do that. But to be honest, we do it all the time at ByteSite. Like we start to clear out jQuery as much as we can, but we still use jQuery's AJAX function because it helps us a lot actually. So that's what I'm going to do. And this is the first time I've ever done it directly in a JavaScript only Webpack application. So we'll see how that goes. So jQuery, for those who don't know, is a JavaScript library that gives you a lot of convenience, a lot of convenience functions. So it used to be the king of JavaScript libraries, actually. Like it actually allowed us to do a lot of really fancy stuff back in the day. But nowadays, there are JavaScript itself has gotten better with ES 2015. And there are other libraries that compete with this for sure. But jQuery used to be the king of like front end browser JavaScript code. So it is a library, and what we're going to do is we're going to import it using npm, just like how we imported React using npm. Okay. So I'm just going to bring up my terminal here. Just going to stop the server. And let's find out how it ships, actually. I think it's just literally called jQuery. So go to npm. Axios is a popular library for data fetching these days. I didn't know that's specifically what it was for. Okay, so yeah, I heard about Axios. I never used it. Good to know though that Axios. This is just Dave messaging here. That Axios is really popular for fetching data, so that's pretty interesting. Curious, Dave, does Axios, like, can you just use it to do very simple, like, GET requests and stuff like that? So maybe we could try it out. Obviously, yeah, lots of crazy stuff surrounding the George Floyd incident. So nice to see these all the technology companies supporting what's happening there. So let's see here. This might not be the right thing I'm thinking of. Oh no, sorry. This isn't even the technology company. That's yep, misspoke there. But I have seen other technology companies supporting what's happening, which is great. So, okay, so Axios here. Promise-based HTTP client. Ooh, promise-based. Okay, pushing my definitely pushing my JavaScript knowledge. Only starting recently to get comfortable with promises. So we get the response. Okay, I think I'm not going to venture into this today, but definitely good to know that this is a popular way to do things. Curious how it handles the JSON parsing. I know with fetch the promise returns unparsed data, and then you kind of parse it. Which is one of the pieces that I really like about jQuery, actually. So I'm not going to venture into Axios today, but good to know that if you guys are looking for a library to do fetches, that's a way you can do it. Again, I definitely fully admit that I'm not super comfortable with JavaScript promises fully yet, so I'm going to stick with jQuery today. Okay, but definitely good to know. Okay, so jQuery, yep, just ships as an npm library, so I'm going to do yarn add jQuery. So that should update our package.json file. So our package.json file should have jQuery show up in it in a second. Once this finishes. jQuery, do I need to refresh it? What's going on here? I'm in my React setup. Package.json. Do I just have to did it not install it? jQuery. Look at my yarn.walk. Yeah, jQuery got installed there. Why is it not in the package.json? Oh, it is there. I'm blind. Yeah, right down here, right at the bottom there. Okay, so jQuery got added as a dependency. So it recorded the version in here, and ultimately what that does is download the source code into this node modules here. So node modules has a jQuery. Where is it? jQuery folder right there. Okay, so now we can import that. So typically jQuery is used with a $sign. So we're going to do that. we're going to implement jQuery here. All right. Start up our dev server again. And with jQuery, what we can do is we can very easily construct a web request. So what we can do is in load colors, we are going to do an AJAX request like this. Okay, so AJAX is a function that jQuery implements. Okay, like they have a function called AJAX. And it is a function that takes in an object, and that object has a bunch of values. It has a URL, type of request, the data type that you expect to come back, and then if it succeeds, what do you want to do? What function do you want to call? And then if there's an error, what function do you want to call? Okay. All right, so the URL that we're going to call is this right here. So we're going to make a request to request response.in/API/colors, which should return this stuff here. The type of request is a get. This is also could be considered a method if you want. The data type that we expect to get back is JSON. Okay, and the function callback that comes back, it is going to be called and pass in the response as the first variable there. So the data will come back with there. And we're just going to stop execution right in there if that works. And then if it doesn't work, we'll stop execution in there as well. Okay, so what's happening here? Okay, so when the component first mounts, component in mount's going to get called, and then that's going to call this .loadColors. When this .loadColors gets called, it's going to make an AJAX request. The AJAX request is going to send a request out to API colors, and then when it responds, it's going to call this success function. If it fails, it's going to call this error function. Okay, so everything ran, and it looks like it actually paused, and let's see where we are. So it looks like we're in the success callback right there. Okay, so that worked. Okay, so we're sitting right in here, actually, and you can see this variable. Actually, there's the data right there. So the data actually did come back properly, which is great. Yes, Dave just mentioned that we should do a video on promises and async functions. Took me a while to get comfortable with them, but they are awesome. Maybe we can touch them on view. Definitely, yeah, definitely bring that up, Dave, when we're doing that. Yeah, I for the first time last week wrote my first promise, and that took me a long time to understand, actually. I think that actually really helped me understand promises a little bit, but it took me a while for sure, and I still am not that comfortable with them, so I'd love to hear your thoughts for sure. Okay, so the data came back, which is great, and so we have the data sitting in here. Okay, so the data actually is in here, and it's JSON data. So if you look here, JSON data, we can even take a look at it here. So if I type in data, this is what it looks like. It's an object where there's a data. There's a data object. There's a page per page. So there is a data object inside that object. So maybe it's a little bit confusing to call it data. So maybe we'll just call it response. Okay. And let's just kind of take a look at some of this stuff. So let's output let's output a couple of things here. So let's output the page number, and let's output the data that came back. So we're talking about, when we look at this response, right, we're talking about this is the response that came back. So we're going to output this page number here, and we're going to output this data value here, which is this array here. Okay, so let's just take a look and see what that looks like. Okay, so the number 1 came back, and this array is here. Okay, so the array came back, and the array came back with a bunch of colors. All right, that's perfect. So these are the colors that we actually want, right? This is what we actually need here. So that's actually what we need. So if we call, so the colors, we could say let colors, or const colors, we're not changing it, equals response dot data, okay, because that's the array of objects that we need. And then we can simply call this dot set state colors. Okay. So what we've done here is we've got the array that we need, and we've called set state on the colors. And so that is going to cause this whole thing to re-render with this new array set as the colors there. Okay, so let's save that. And there we go. Okay. Now there's a couple things we can do a little bit shorter here. We could either put response data directly in here if we want. But I kind of like, because they haven't named their thing colors, I think this makes it a little bit clearer. But we can do a little bit of a shortcut here. There's a nice ES 2015 trick here, where if your key name and your variable, if your key name and your value is coming from a variable with the same name, you can just get rid of that and it'll actually do it for you. So we can do that. Okay, so there we go. Nothing has effectively changed, so it's not reloading, so that's all right. And there we go. Okay, so let's get a little bit slightly fancier with our stuff here, because we actually do have some fun information that we can use. Like they've given us a hex code that we can use, actually, this color here. So why don't we actually style those divs to have backgrounds of those colors? So we could basically create a style here, and we could say background color is going to be, I think it's just color. Yeah, there we go. That's pretty cool. Okay, so what's happening there is, maybe I shouldn't call this color. That's maybe, yeah, maybe that is a little bit tough to follow. Okay, so let's call this, because these are Pantone colors, and the Pantone colors have a hex color associated with them, right? Okay, so let's call the collection Pantone colors. Okay, so let's change that state variable name, change this state variable name, and then we're going to change this state variable name, and we'll change the name of this variable as well. Okay, so we'll just kind of change that. And then why don't we change the name of this method as well, as function as well. So we'll say Pantone, load Pantone colors. Okay. And then that way, when we iterate over it, each individual Pantone color we can call Pantone color. And this will help a little bit with seeing what we're talking about there. Okay, so the Pantone color has a variable called color sitting on it, right? If you look at the Pantone colors, each one of them has a color value on it, right? And all I'm doing is setting the background of this div to equal that color there. And that's what's kind of giving us this nice little thing there. Okay. All right. So that's how we grab the information from the server right there. Okay. Now, let's make this look a little bit nicer maybe. So I'm just going to put my code like this, just so it's a little bit easier to read. We'll give this a class name, say Pantone color, and just add some CSS there. There we go. Okay, that's looking pretty nice. Maybe we just give it a little bit of styling there. There. Okay, that's looking pretty cool. All right, so that's how we deal with server data. Now, one thing is, we can't always expect server data to be instantaneously available. Here, it's pretty fast, actually. Like, you'll see the header loads first, so there's a brief moment where it's empty, and then the data comes in, right? Well, okay, so So the nice thing about this rec-res is they actually have a method that you can delay the response just to simulate what the real what a slow server might look like, right? So they actually have a way that you can actually pass in a delay. So I can actually pass in a delay here and delay it for like 2 seconds before the response comes back. So what I can do is I can see what that's going to look like. So see Pantone Colors loads, and then 2 seconds later the response actually comes back, right? So that's a very common scenario. So how do you handle that? Okay, well, very common thing, again, is to show a loading indicator. Okay, so what we can do there is, again, think about declarative UI, right? So you want to declare a state where this thing is loading, and then when it's done loading, you're good to go, okay? Now, there's two ways we can do this. We can either base this on how many Pantone colors there are. We can say, well, if the Pantone colors length is 0, well, then show a loading indicator. Otherwise, show the rest of the map here, okay? Now, that technically can work. So I'll show you what that looks like. Okay, so what I can do is here, okay, so before we render the colors, I'm actually going to do a ternary operator, okay? So I'm going to say if this dot state dot Pantone colors, if the length is equal to 0, we're in a state where we're loading, right? Okay. And then, so there's going to be something here. And then if we're not, there's going to be something there, okay? Now I'm just going to separate these onto multiple lines. Okay, so if we are there, we're like that. Okay, and this is kind of where I'm. So basically we're saying, if this condition is true, render this, else render this, okay? So let's just kind of see if that works first of all. Okay, so we'll say, Pantone colors is empty, and Pantone colors is full. Okay, so what this is saying is, check this condition. If it's true, render this div. Otherwise, render this div. Okay, so let's see if that works. All right, so when the page loads, Pantone colors is empty, and then it's full. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. Now, that's not really what we want. Really what we want is we want this to be loading, right? So if it's empty, you're loading. Otherwise, render the actual colors. So I'm just going to move this up. Oh, right. Different ID. Okay, so I just copy and pasted that. The formatting kind of got out of whack there. Whoops. Okay, so there we go. So we're basically saying if Pantone colors length is 0, render this div with the word loading in it. Otherwise, render this right here. Okay. So let's see how that looks. So it's loading, and then they're there. Okay. So that's one way you can do it, and that is very common to do it that way. So when we initially mount the component, right, it's the Pantone colors is empty, so we're relying on that to be loading, and then once this is loaded, this gets set to the certain state there. Now, the reason I don't like this is that, well, what happens if your server returns you an empty array? You're not really loading anymore, right? You've loaded it, but there just doesn't happen to be any color. That doesn't have to be any colors in there, right? So what I like to do is actually introduce another state variable to control that. Okay, so we're going to create another state variable called loading. All right, and it's going to start off with true. So when we first start off with this component, the React component is going to be, the variable is going to be loading true. And then once we finish loading the variables, I'm going to set loading to false. Okay, and then so this will no longer be based on the length. This will be based on the variable loading. All right, so let's see how that looks. So we're loading, and then boom. Okay, so that's how you can deal with fetching server data. So hopefully that makes a lot of sense. If you have any questions, definitely leave them below. Now, one thing I want to do is take this a little bit further and start to show you again where the power of these kind of reusable components comes into play here. Okay, so what I have here is I have this div, which is kind of this encapsulated Pantone color, right? It's just a Pantone color here. And so, it's got a div itself, and maybe it would have a button or something, it's got the name in there, but maybe, it would have other things in there as well. So this could get pretty complex, right? And so why don't we nest that into its own component? Okay, and I'll show you what I mean by that. Okay, so what we have here is we have this homepage.js, which is which itself is a component. Okay, so let's create a new component. So we're going to create a new file, and I'm going to call this component Pantone color. Okay, so I'm going to create a new component called Pantone color. All right, and it's going to mimic the same thing here. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to import React. Okay, now I'm not going to import React DOM because the only place we use React DOM in this entire component was not even in the component itself. It was actually outside of the component. It's here. The only time we use React DOM is to mount a component to an HTML page. Okay, if we're not actually mounting it to an HTML page, but we're using a different mechanism to mount it, we don't actually need the React DOM. So I'm not going to import that. Okay. So let's create a new component. I'm going to call it Pantone color. Again, components always start with capital, as do class names for that matter. Okay, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the module exporting here. So I'm going to export that component. And then remember, the bare minimum I need here is to render. So I'm going to render something. So I'm just going to say div. And then in here, I'm just going to put, test Pantone component. Okay. So this is a component. And we are going to use this component inside this component. Okay. So I've exported the component, which means now other files can use this. So what I can do now is I can import that component. I can say import, and I'm going to call it the same name, but you can technically call it whatever you want. You can call, this variable can be called whatever you want, actually. But where I'm getting it from is this file. You don't need JS. Webpack will know about that. Okay, so what it's going to basically do is it's basically saying, take this component and assign it to the variable name Pantone color. That's how the import and exports work. Okay, so once I have that, this is where it really gets nice. Now I can use that component just like a regular HTML element. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to iterate over the Pantone colors, and rather than render a div, I'm actually going to render this Pantone color component. Okay, so I'm going to return this Pantone color component. So when you create a component and you don't need to mount it to an HTML page, but you're just using it inside another component, you can use the JSX syntax to use that component like this. Okay, so it's really nice that way. All right, very similar to how we use actually the homepage thing down here. Okay, so create a component, you import it, and then you can use it here. Okay. Now, because these are still children in a list, we still do need a unique identifier in the key. So we can't avoid that. Still have that. Okay, so what's going to happen? So we're going to load the colors. The color is going to be iterated over. And for every color, it's going to return this component. This component is going to call render here, which is going to render this div test Pantone component. Okay, so let's see what that looks like. And there we go. So for every color that came in, this test Pantone component got set there. Okay, so now we can start using what we know about props. Okay, so we want each Pantone color to represent the color that we're passing in here, right? So on top of the key, let's pass in a prop. The prop will be called Pantone color. So we're actually going to pass in the Pantone color object in here. Okay, so a little bit confusing because we have the word Pantone color everywhere here, but basically we have a component called Pantone color that takes in a property called Pantone color. And the value of Pantone color is the object Pantone color that's coming in from here. Okay. You could almost view this as like Pantone color data if you want, or Pantone color object. Okay. So we're passing that in as a property. So now when we get into here, into Pantone color in here, we now have access to that as a property, right? So we could change this div to this dot props. So we have the Pantone color property, and we should have the name on that. And so now the name is back. So we're doing well there. Okay, let's add back the class that we had. I think we had Pantone color as our class. This is not going to look right because they're all white. Yeah, there they are. Okay. And then we also had a style on this. So it had a background color where we were using Pantone color. There we go. Okay. So now we've kind of encapsulated all that div logic. We've kind of encapsulated all that div logic into its own component. Okay, so now we have this powerful reusable component that we can use anywhere, passing in the prop that we need or whatever, right? Okay, so that's all working really nicely. And now what we can do is we can just change this component as we need to kind of make this, do whatever we want, right? So for example, this is its own component. So you could have its own event handlers in here. So I could say, I could have a handle click event handler in here. So I could have handle click, and we'll say, we'll say alert. We'll say you've clicked on, and then we'll pass in the Pantone color name. Okay. So we could say that if this gets clicked on, so we'll say on click, like the whole component gets clicked on, what it will do is send up an alert and say you've clicked on the Pantone color name. So we're in here. You've clicked on True Red. You've clicked on Aqua Sky, and so on. Okay? So that is where React starts to get really, really interesting, is when you start to break down your stuff into components like this. Again, you can do some really cool stuff here too, with what you pass in as the props, and it has its own internal state, and you start to reuse components that way, which is really nice. So what's really nice about this is now I have this component called Pantone color, where I can use anywhere on the site, right? Anywhere on the website, I can basically use that, right? And that's where, again, React gets really powerful, because a lot of the times when you build React, you kind of build React components that are kind of one-time use. Like, for example, again, this homepage component is only going to be used once. It's not going to be used multiple times in other places. It's just going to be used on the homepage. And then even like subcomponents of this may only be used once because you're kind of building it very specifically for that page. But then a lot of times what you end up getting into is you get into these components that you want to kind of place everywhere. Like, so let's say you had a buy now button, and the buy now button basically you would execute, adding something to your cart and bringing you to the checkout page. And let's say you want to put this buy now button all over the website, right? You could create a component specifically for buy now, and all you have to do is pass in the item that you want to purchase, right? And then anytime you click buy now, it has all that functionality encapsulated within it, which is really nice, right? And then the other really major place where this comes into play is a lot of times teams will build UI kits, right? They'll build components that basically replace all your regular components, okay? Like they'll build a component for a button, for a link, for an input, all these things, and they'll style them a certain way, and they'll have their own default kind of functionality and stuff like that. And then you'll have these usable components that you use instead of the traditional anchor tag or the header tag and stuff like that. And in fact, there's other libraries that do this. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Twitter Bootstrap. Well, there's something called React Strap, which is basically Twitter Bootstrap components, but they're shipped as React components, right? So rather than creating like a button with a class on it, you just have to use this button component from React Strap, and that's kind of like the idea there. So things get kind of really interesting there in terms of reusing components that way. Okay. Couple last things to clean up the code a little bit here. Anytime in ES 2015, if you have a function and it's basically a one-liner returning something, you can actually get rid of a lot of this bracketing and just have basically an arrow and a return value. So we get rid of that. There. So basically what you have is you have a value which returns that. Yeah, so you can do something like that. I personally do not like this syntax. I find it's not as easily modifiable. I actually prefer this syntax like this because if I were to modify this, I now can easily just come in here and start adding lines to my code here, right? It's kind of like single line if statements too. I'm not a big fan of because again, if you want to add more stuff to that if condition, you then might have to put extra braces around it and stuff like that. So I'm actually going to leave it like that. So okay, all right. I think I'm going to stop there. We did not get to React Forms, but I think that's a good place to stop. So yeah, so if you guys have any questions, definitely let me know. Or if you guys want to see how certain things work, definitely let me know. Going to start to wrap things up here, but now I'm going to open up the floor to kind of the general discussion that we usually have. But next week, again, barring any unforeseen technical issues, we are going to have Dave Chapman join us. He's going to join us. I think I'm going to try to use Skype because Skype is really nicely compatible with the open broadcasting software that I use. And he's going to teach me Vue, and he's going to walk me through potentially promises as well. Actually, we'll see how far we get with that. I'm hoping, Dave, that we can maybe use this Webpack setup to deal with Vue. Hopefully, we can just import it as a library similar to React and just use it from there. Not sure. Otherwise, we might have to go through some setup steps, but I'm assuming Vue ships as an npm package. Yep. Hopefully there isn't a crazy amount of setup that we need. But anyways, yeah. So that's what we're going to be doing next week. We're just going to be talking about Vue. I really don't know it at all. Besides some brief conversations with Dave and understanding, doing very little brief reading. But yeah, we'll be doing that next week. So we're going to take a pause on React. Using the Vue CLI is super easy though. Set up, start a project, up to you. Okay, yeah, no, that's perfect. If there's a Vue CLI, we can definitely do that. Is the Vue CLI itself shipped through npm? I'm assuming it probably is. Just like as a global package, maybe not. Vue CLI. Yeah. Okay. Global package. Cool. Awesome. Okay. Yeah, we can definitely do that. I will definitely install that. Well, maybe not. Maybe I'll just leave it, and then you can walk me through that as well. So, okay. So, any other questions, guys, on React and how we were doing things there? I mean, again, that is a very common pattern. I use that all the time. Is showing a loading screen before we fetch the data, and then we kind of go fetch the data. I can show you a kind of really fancy version of it. So that's what we do. So this is one of our major projects at ByteSite. So we do that. So we do that there, for example. So that's there. You saw the little loading indicator there, and then we fetch, and then we show this stuff. But we also do slightly fancier versions of it. Like if we click on a page here, we show these kind of loading. Well, that's a bit too fast. Page is too fast, I guess. But you can see there's these kind of loading placeholders, and then it shows the product at that point. So, so this is all built in React, by the way. This like the majority of this site is built in React, actually. So yeah, I can do definitely a lot of really cool stuff with them. I mean, the reality is all these frameworks, you know, I mean, even without these frameworks, you can do like a lot of what you just saw. You know, back in the day, we were doing with jQuery. The majority of that site used to be built in jQuery, and so it's definitely you know, it's definitely possible to do anything really with any of these languages. It's just, you know, different things make it harder. Sorry, different frameworks make it easier or harder to do depending on how you're thinking. Okay, maybe I will talk a little bit about forms. Dave has asked the question. I'm curious what makes them complicated in React. Okay, so the complicated thing about forms in React is really just kind of throwing out the notion of the default behavior of a input field. Okay, so what I mean by that, let's do a really quick example actually. Okay, so what we do here is, okay, so let's say I have a text field in here. Okay, so we'll put an input type text, and we'll just put an text field in there. Okay, so we have a text field there. And actually, maybe for this example, I'll just disable the loading of the Pantone colors. So I'm just going to disable this right now. Okay, so we have a text field here where you can type, okay? And normally when you type in a text field, you are just typing, right? Okay, but if you think about it, when we do that, we don't really have control over that input in terms of React, in the sense that we have something now that is changing its visual appearance inside the component, but we're not actually controlling that, right? Like this input field itself is controlling what's on there, right? It's not like we are changing a state variable and the state variable is controlling what's showing up, right? Unlike everything else we've done in React, when we click on something, the result of that is going through a state update and re-rendering stuff, right? So the slight leap that you have to make when you're dealing with forms and input, specifically input fields, is what you want to effectively do is intercept somebody typing inside that. Okay, so what you want to do is when I type the letter H, I actually don't want the field to handle that. I actually want to intercept that H type. And then what I want to do is update some state variable that is then going to subsequently re-render the DOM and have H show up in that input field. Okay, so this is how it works. So let's say I have a state variable called, so let's pretend that this is a name field. Okay, so we're just gonna, we have a name field to type in here. Okay, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna create a new state variable called name, and it's gonna start off empty. Okay. And what we're going to do is we are going to now control the output of what's inside, what's being displayed in that text field. Okay. So we're going to take over that. And the way we're going to do that is we are going to specify the value of that input text field. Okay. We're going to specify that value as this .state.name. Okay. So let's see what happens there. Okay, so right now it's empty, so it shouldn't show anything. But if I change that state variable, then it should show that value in there. Okay, so that's what's happening there. So now we are taking over that input. We are actually controlling that input versus React controlling it, right? In terms of what's just being displayed there. But now we have to close the loop on that because that's all well and good if we just leave it alone. But what happens if someone actually starts to type in there, okay? So this is where we actually need to intercept the input. So if the input value actually changes, we need to intercept that. So we create an on change. So let's say we say handle name change. Okay, so let's bind that. Okay, and then what we're going to do is we are actually going to, so when a change event on that input happens, we are then going to call this dot set state on the name. So we're going to update the name because the name in the state variable is what is being shown as the value, right? And in fact, actually watch what happens if we don't. Okay, so if we don't change that input value, okay, this is what happens. So we're here, and every time we type, nothing happens, right? Because what's happening is the value is being rendered by this.state.name, which is not updating in this case. So onChange is being called to handle our typing, but it's not actually updating the value that we need to update, right? So what we need to do is we need to call setState on the name to whatever the value that came from that change was. So now if we do this, this will actually handle our changes here. Okay? So we've taken over control of that input by saying, okay, when a change on the input happens, don't just do the default behavior of letting that input handle it. What we do is we intercept that with this call, which updates the value that's being displayed, and it shows it there. Now, what's really slick about this, though, and this is why this is a little bit annoying, right? Because you have to do all that just to make sure that you can type something. What's really nice about it, though, is that we now control that, which means two things. One, we have super easy access to whatever value is there because we're controlling that value. So if we later on want to submit this value or whatever, we can just call it this.setState.name, right? So if we want to do an AJAX call or a post request or something like that with that, we actually have access to this.state.name really easily. The second thing that's really nice about this is we fully control what the output is no matter what they type. So what that means is we can do things like intercept whatever they typed and replace it with something else, right? So let's say, for example, we want to anything that someone types, we want to uppercase it, okay? So what we could do is we could do e.target.value.to uppercase. Right? So what we're doing is we're intercepting the value that's coming in, and then we're uppercasing it and setting that to the name, which is what we display in the output here. Okay? Now this is not uppercase yet because I haven't typed anything, right? This onChange hasn't been called yet. So if I now start to type, oh, no, something is wrong there. The value to uppercase, is it like that? I think it's like that. Yeah, and then it gets uppercase, even though I'm typing lowercase right now. You could do things like formatting and all that stuff too as well. So that's where it gets a little bit tedious. So and if you think about it, powerful, but tedious to set up, right? Because if you think about it, if you have 30 fields, you have to create 30 event handlers. That gets a little bit crazy, right? So what ends up happening is you create kind of this smart, intelligent way to handle all the inputs. So you have the same input handler, but you change like the name of every field, which you would do in a normal form anyways, I guess. But that kind of leap is what I'm talking about. Is this going from an uncontrolled component to uncontrolled input to a controlled input, where you're basically intercepting the change to update the value. But the benefit is that once it's set up, you have a lot of flexibility at that point, right? So I kind of consider it like the same leap of going to declarative UI, right? It's like once you kind of go there, it kind of makes sense in the sense of you're updating state and it's updating the view, things like that. But the initial time I dealt with forms, I remember dealing with this, and I remember thinking like, whoa, this is very tedious to deal with. But over time, you start to realize you can kind of do that together. So like in one single method. So by the way, if you want to take this a little step further, the way we do this usually is we usually have a name field on here. So we'd say the name field is like the name of in this case it would be name. And then we usually change this to just handle change. So this would just be handle like input change. And then we do some clever working around this where we say e.target.name. So it dynamically sets those variables. That's how we deal with it. But again, so that seems like a lot to just set up an input field, right? So Vue has the same complication. However, it has some syntactic sugar to make the hookup much simpler. Okay, cool. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. So again, I mean, I'm assuming Vue has basically the same kind of some of the same principles as React, right? Like declarative UI, an internal state, props, and maybe they don't call them props or state, but kind of similar ideas. So yeah, so I guess we kind of quickly went through input fields there, but we'll see them maybe in a bit better example next time we come back to React, which who knows where it might be. So because again, next week we're taking a break, we're going to Vue. So any other questions or any other comments or any other discussion or any other suggestions for? Again, Dave is joining me next week. He may be more of a regular guest after next week. Again, I have your questions prepared for Dave. I mean, if Dave is comfortable with it, aside from our Vue.js kind of interaction, maybe we'll have an open Q&A for Dave as well. So yeah. Interesting to hear there is lots of overlap there. So I'm wondering if Vue. Dave, I'm curious. Is Vue also taking the wide approach of like, because again, React has now started to bleed into React Native, and then React Native is starting to get into this idea of React, like React Web, and starting to really get into this idea of using the same principles of state and props, but kind of across platforms. I'm wondering, is Vue starting to kind of, is there libraries that Vue themselves are developing, or third-party apps that are developing, or third-party libraries that are developing, say, so you can use Vue's JavaScript in other contexts other than web? I'm very curious about that, actually, because that is definitely one of I talked about this before, but definitely one of the really nice side benefits I had of working with React. Like I didn't choose React because of that. It was this really nice side benefit that React Native started gaining some steam after React was developed and after I got into React. So. Any other questions from anybody else? Oh, awesome! Vue's moving in that direction too. That's really cool. I mean, that's great. Like this is, it's. I don't know how much. I'm very curious actually what the adoption of things like that are, because obviously I'm super happy with it because I'm coming from a web development background. So things that are more web developy obviously are really nice. But I'm curious if like the wider world is starting to adopt those. I'm assuming not. It's kind of like, I like to think that like so much of the world is doing kind of web development stuff, but I have a feeling still a massive chunk of the world is doing kind of like Java development, C development, things like that. So I wouldn't be surprised if like Expo, React Native, Flutter, these things are only a tiny percentage of mobile development. Vue Native, there is a Vue Native implementation. Cool. Vue 3 coming out later this year. It's going to have much better support for Vue Native. Very cool, very cool. Yeah, I'm very curious when, like I know when Angular, I can't remember what version, maybe 3 came out, that it was such a big change from Angular 2. And it sounds like Dave's very excited about Vue 3. I'm curious if or when React might have a major version upgrade and like what it'll be like, because they've done a lot of incremental things that are non-breaking changes. Even though they've introduced like hooks and functional components and all this stuff, they definitely changed some major things, but nothing's breaking, and nothing so mind blowing that it's like, oh my god, I can't wait for that. Actually, like most of React of what I've used, it's a lot of the new stuff I use in React is more is more out of like fear that I'm going to fall behind. Actually, like I'm perfectly comfortable using class components over functional components. Like I'm more comfortable if anything, and I don't see a huge need to go to functional components, at least from what I dealt with. But I am doing it anyways, because I feel like I might be left behind. And not to mention, I have heard some of the benefits that I definitely agree with. And so when I'm ready to take advantage of those benefits, it'll be interesting. So, yeah, so it'll be interesting to see if React hits a major version change at some point. But yeah, very cool, very cool. Um, yeah, any other questions? Any other discussion? Okay, well, I'm gonna again kind of start to wrap up here. Again, big thanks to Dave, and also want to give a shout out to Ricky and anybody else that might be joining us. Ricky, hopefully you learned a little bit more in React today. Again, definitely open to your questions. But again, if as always, if you guys haven't already, subscribe to the channel and hit that bell icon. And you can follow me on Twitter for any announcements. That's also where I post anything about like cancellations of shows. So unfortunately, these shows kind of come together very last minute. So if I'm going to cancel a show, it might kind of come very last minute. I'm trying to keep up weekly, but if there is some reason, or I'm just having an off night, or something else came up, or I just need a little bit of a break, I'll be kind of announcing stuff on Twitter, because unfortunately on YouTube there is no really easy way to do that unless you have a lot of subscribers. I can't actually post an announcement or anything like that. So definitely keep an eye on that, and definitely spread the word too. Again, I the last couple of weeks we've had 3 to 5 people watching at a time, which is great, because before that we're only getting like 1 to 2 every night. And so I definitely hope you guys spread the word. And definitely take advantage of what I'm saying about learning what you guys want to learn. So, I mean, I obviously don't know everything, but if there's something that I know or I do that you guys are interested in, definitely don't be shy about suggesting it to me. Again, if you want to message me on Twitter, you can. Whatever way you want to get in touch with me, you definitely can let us know. So I know there's a lot of things that sometimes people just kind of take for granted, that like. And they want to learn a little bit more about it, right? It's like, oh, I've always wanted to know how to make a button look nice in CSS, right? Like for years, I didn't know CSS well, and I would always I knew how to do some graphic design in Photoshop. So for years, I was just using like graphics to make all my web pages look really nice, like little like static images. So things like that, where it's just like like sometimes I find development, sometimes it's hard because like so many people come from so many different learning spaces and learning styles and experience, and sometimes just some of the simplest things, sometimes people don't get a chance to learn formally. So always happy to even do something that you may think is simple, as obviously as long as I understand it or I know it. Obviously I don't know everything, so but I sometimes feel that when I do talk to some developers, that there are a lot of cases where there's a misunderstanding about what they know. And I'm not saying, again, I know everything, but I do try to sometimes get a little bit of a deeper understanding. And just the nature of the length of time I've been in it, right? Like, been doing web development for about 12 years now, and you pick up new things. Like I remember I was using like web authentication for ages, like signing in and like signing into an account. And I remember for years like just not understanding how the basics of that worked, you know? And I remember actually it was around the time I was working with Dave, actually, that I think I kind of talked with him about it and kind of finally started to understand how that worked and how that authentication worked. And also realizing how like delicate it can be, which is kind of interesting actually. So there's that, and I might not even fully understand it today. I mean, I think what I can offer people is a somewhat clear understanding of how something might work, but it might not actually work that way. My explanations, I think, work functionally because they're essentially what something is doing, but not exactly what something is doing. I've been teaching some Ruby on Rails, and I've been explaining to people a lot how has many works and belongs to. And I've kind of come up with my explanation of it. I've since come to learn, though, that it's not really fully accurate how I'm talking about it. But it's a good enough understanding that it kind of gets you really far, actually. I was talking about DNS servers with one of my coworkers, and how DNS lookup works and all this stuff, and when you buy a domain and how that works. And there was a guy sitting beside us in the office, and he said, like in a really nice way, he's just kind of letting us know, he's like, actually, to be honest, that's not exactly how it works. And he definitely knew way more than I did. He was in like IT services and stuff like that, and he said the same thing. He'd gone years thinking that is how it works, and then one day he found a YouTube video that explained it completely differently, and it completely changed how he learned things. So I feel like I can maybe get certain people to a next step, but obviously I have to get to a next step as well. Like I'm constantly learning about all the things that I'm dealing with, like with Ruby on Rails, with web development. Like there's so many things like that I just take for granted how they work, and I take for granted that my understanding is correct. Like there's so much with web that it's just like you can get so far without really understanding anything. Like cookies, for example. I didn't understand cookies for a really long time, and even my knowledge of cookies today is like okay. Like I kind of get what they do, and I kind of get how they work. But if you were to ask me like how did Chrome program a cookie, yeah, forget it. Like I have no idea. Like that's another interesting topic that I really didn't know anything about. Like the internals of a browser. Like how does that actually work? Git is another great example of that. Git is something that I feel like I know pretty well, but I really don't know how the internals of Git work. And I learn a little bit more about Git every year, maybe. Git is one of these things where it's like I would love to dissect the .git folder and see what's going on inside there, because it blows my mind how Git actually functions. Like it really it blows my mind that it functions at all, and it functions so well. But I use it, and I claim to understand some basics in terms of branching and all this stuff. But I really, really, if you were to ask me how it truly works under the hood, yeah, like forget it. Like I remember seeing a diagram of Git and how it's a linked list with kind of links back to the previous commit, and that diagram never made sense to me before. Like I was like, why are the arrows pointing backwards? Like how does that work or whatever? And then it's like, oh, okay, it's a linked list and stuff like that. And so that didn't make sense to me for a long time. I have this big series on YouTube called Getting to Know You that explains Git, and I think it works really well as a functional knowledge. But there are a lot of parts of it that are not really quite accurate. So that's what I kind of I would say I kind of would say that I have to offer as someone to share knowledge, is that a lot of the times I find I try to come up with my own explanation of how something works, like based on observation. So like say Ruby on Rails has many belongs to. Based on the observations of using it, I try to decipher internally how that might work, and that's the explanation I come up with. I do not necessarily go and deep dive and look at the source code and figure it out, actually. I just kind of come up with my own explanation of how it works based on using it over years and years and years. And I find that sometimes is a pretty good way to do it, because it's usually coming from a place of from someone who didn't understand. I didn't understand it before, and this is the explanation I came up with, right, based on my observations. And so when I teach somebody something, it's like I know what it was like not to understand it and go from there. The danger in it is, again, that some of this stuff, because I'm coming up with my own explanation, might not actually be accurate. So I fully am aware of that piece. So, all right. I think that's a chocolate chip cookie. Is that a chocolate chip cookie, Ricky? I think so, maybe. Oh, because I mentioned cookies. Yes. I am sometimes very slow when it comes to jokes like that. Okay, guys. It is 9:50. Thanks so much, guys, for watching. I know there's 2 other people watching right now, so thank you, guys. I know not everybody wants to post, not everyone wants to chat, but thanks so much for tuning in. I appreciate, again, the support that you guys are giving me. I'd be lying if I said I am doing it specifically because I learned stuff, but that is a really nice benefit. I ultimately do really like an audience, and I ultimately do really like presenting. I love teaching and educating. It's something that I'm very passionate about. So I thank you guys for giving me an audience. It's really nice. But at the same time, there's a nice side benefit is I do learn things, and again I do definitely get my interest peaked on other topics that I'm not familiar with, like Axios today, right? Like Axios. Now I'm more interested in Axios and see and interested in looking into it or whatever. So thanks so much everybody for tuning in. Next week Thursday, you don't want to miss it. Dave Chapman is hopefully going to make his first appearance. If he doesn't, it's not because of him. It's because we couldn't figure out technical issues. But I really appreciate everything, guys. Spread the word, subscribe, hit the bell icon, and if you're interested in a free acoustic concert this Saturday, tune in at 7 p.m. Should be a lot of fun. Hopefully, I don't lose my voice before then. Yeah, cool. All right, thanks, guys. Stay safe and keep coding.